Well, as I start out, I want to say Happy New Year. I hope you guys are going to have an absolutely great year. And this is, when you hear this, you'll be beginning the first full week of the new year. And I hope it's extremely productive and that you figure out everything really fast and all your work goes really smooth. I remember one time when I was working at the Volkswagen place, I got a job to replace the timing belt and do a valve adjustment on a Volkswagen Rabbit, and that usually it's about a 3-hour flag, and so I says, well, it's 4:25. I'm going to see how much of this I can get done before 5 o'clock instead of putting it off and waiting until the next day to start. So I went ahead and started working on that thing, and believe it or not, that job went so smooth and so fast that I started it up at 5 a.m. I mean at 5 p.m. And that was just totally amazing to me. And so I figured, oh man, I've got this down pat. I've done so many of these. I'm really good at them now. And I'll be able to make lots of money. Well, the next morning, I drew the same exact kind of job on a different car, and it took me 4 hours to do it. And so you just don't ever know how a job's going to go until you get into it. And it doesn't really matter how good you are at it. You can have a bad time on a bad job on a bad day. This was a doofus TV show thing. I noticed on one of the episodes of Rockford Files, and I looked for it, but I couldn't find it because I watched it in real time when it was on TV. The bad guys started out, and they were driving one of these really nice late model Mercedes at the time. There were 4 of them sitting there, and it made them look really important. They showed them driving down the road sometime later. These same 4 guys, and this car had deteriorated to a Ford like this, like a 76 Ford LTD. And by the time Rockford ran into it with a motorhome and turned it over in the final scene, it had turned into a radio a Fairlane that I guess their budget wouldn't permit them to keep these guys in a Mercedes the whole time and destroy it. The only thing all those cars had in common was they were 4-door white cars. Now this 67 New Yorker, my dad had actually decided he was going to replace my mom's yellow 66 New Yorker, and he was going to sell the 66 model after he bought her 73 Imperial, which was really a lousy car, but that old 66 was a really good one. And so he found this woman that had this 67 Chrysler, and she had stopped at a gas station in Daleville somewhere, and she said, told the boy that to pour some STP oil treatment in her engine, and he poured gas treatment in there, and he washed all of the oil off the wrist pins. And when she parked it at home, when she got home, all of that STP cleaned all of that stuff off those wrist pins. That's what we determined along with it later, because whenever we pulled the pistons out of it, it wouldn't turn real fast. It wouldn't turn fast enough to start the car. So I had to pull all of that stuff down, tore the engine completely down, and took the rods and pistons up there to the machine shop and had Cliff to press them out and press them back in there where they would flop around freely like they were supposed to. But I drove that car for a pretty good while, and it was that's it, parked in the driveway in front of the little house we lived in, and that thing was a cruiser. And one day I was going through Mississippi on the way to Texas driving it, and this 76 Pontiac kept passing me and slowing down. And so he did that his car was brand new at the time, because this was in like 1976. And so I'm saying, doggone it, what's the matter with you? So he'd pass, I was going about 62 miles an hour, 63, because the speed limit was 55 then. And he'd pass me and slow down to 55. And I'd pass him, then he'd pass me again, slow down to 55. After he did that about 4 times, finally I just kept on pushing the pedal down until that old upside down speedometer on his Chrysler went out of sight, and all he had was about 100 miles an hour, so he couldn't pass me if I didn't want him to. But this thing also had a rear window defrost in it. It had tilt and telescope steering wheel and all the bells and whistles, and an extra switch on the floor that looked like a dimmer switch, and when you tap it with your foot, the radio would search for stations. But in the back it had a rear window defrost that was actually a heater core back there with a fan and all that, and there were long hoses going through the car back here feeding that thing. I didn't even know that's how it worked until one day when I was at the college out there driving around the college loop that hose busted inside the car and filled the car up with steam. That was the craziest thing. I just went ahead and bypassed that thing. I wasn't going to buy all that heater hose and replace it going all the way to the back. This is a torsion bar, and the reason torsion bars are used is because when you have a four-wheel drive with this going out to the wheel, you got no room for a spring. And so this is a piece of spring steel, and it's basically got a hex on the front, and there's a hex in this adjustable, it's like a big old wrench in the back is on the other end of that. And this torsion bar, I've talked about this before, but these things right here have to be put in there the right way. If you put the wrong torsion bar in there, if you swap them around or put them in there backwards or something like that, they're just made to work a certain way, and they're stiffer one way than they are the other and all that. But anyway, that's a torsion bar, and that's the reason they have torsion bars is that when I was at the Volkswagen Mazda dealer, there was a doggone Mazda pickup I had to pull a transmission out of, and it was like seemed like maybe a 3-hour flag or something like that. Pull out and put it back in. May have been more than that. Anyway, it seemed like it did play 3 hours, pull it out, put it back. So I could do that real quick. I'd pull out and put it back and put a clutch in there and put it back in about 45 minutes. Didn't have torsion bars though. Wasn't four-wheel drive. Well, the very next day they gave me a Nissan pickup that was four-wheel drive, and it had torsion bars on it. And it still paid just 3 hours to pull the transmission and put it back, but it took me about a half a day to do that one because it was a stupid torsion bars were all in the way and everything. And I wasn't willing to take those out because at the time it seemed like they'd be too much trouble. This is ball joint stuff. You know, when you got one of these ball joint kits, you got to really fish around in there and get the right adapters and put them on there the right way to push them ball joints out. And a lot of times I'd have to, whenever I was taking an old ball joint out, I'd have to cut that ball joint off so I could press it out of there without any problem. Putting it back in was no issue. But this thing right here has got some seriously strong threads. Make sure you put grease on them. You can just about move the world with that doggone thing. It is seriously tough. It's also really handy for doing U-joints. Of course, I've done U-joints in a parking lot with a piece of wood and a hammer and a drift, you know, but long and the short of it is, this one here was on his Ford and it popped right there as the boy was turning into his house. It broke. That ball joint did. And you can see where it came from. See? So we basically, that ball joint, and when a ball joint breaks, you don't ever know when it's going to happen. I think I talked about that before last week. But this one here popped. And he was just, after this, he was scared to drive that vehicle, and his mother had to get him something else because he just was, if he'd have been driving down the road and it broke, like I said on that one last week, but he wasn't. He was, these things usually break whenever you're stopping and turning, when you're in a parking lot maneuver. Now, a tie rod end can come apart at any time. And, you know, seen that happen both ways. EGR systems, you need to understand what's going on there. Some people will try to claim that they're reburning some of the exhaust gas. Well, that's a bunch of hooey. The exhaust gas is inert. And so what they do is they take about 5% of the exhaust gas when the EGR is open, and it runs just a little bit of exhaust gas into the stream, and it cools the combustion chamber because there's not as much in there to burn, because it displaces some of the oxygen, and so it makes it, you still got power. You might notice when the EGR is flowing, whenever it's idling, the intake manifold will get really hot, and you know, if it's just and it'll have a rough idle. Now on these diesels, if you open the EGR on a diesel, it's going to run quieter, which is, it's a peculiar thing that EGR does to one of these electronic diesels. Whenever you got these, you'll get a P0401 code if this EGR passage is stopped up. And this one here was clogged up with crud, and so, you know, we pulled the EGR valve off of it, and I took this piece of old park brake cable and you know, cut it on the end and made a little whiskers on it, put it in the drill, and that way it's flexible, so I can go down through there. This is on a Pontiac Aztec, if I remember right. These EGR valves on these GM cars, on the other ones that have these 5 wires, they got 2 wires to run the motor, and they got 3 wires to do the position sensor. You can see how that's wired up. It's pretty cool. On the Fords, they got a little orifice in the EGR supply tube, and whenever this DPFE sensor is reading a pressure increase, whenever you are running pressure through here, the pressure goes up in this tube, and it drops in this tube, so it's reading the pressure differential. That's why they call it a DPFE, differential pressure EGR valve, or whatever the name is. Of course, it's got this, EGR vacuum regulator. The later ones, some of them would just have one pipe going to them, the later PFE sensors. And the first ones that came out were little gray ones. These plastic ones, whenever they're at rest, they're on like 1 volt. The metal ones that you had on some of the older ones is like 0.6 of a volt or something like that when you're at default. I got to where I was measuring voltages on all of those. But understanding EGR is pretty doggone important if you're going to, be going after a PO401 code or one of those other codes that's EGR related. And on these right here, you can actually command the EGR open and look at the feedback and see if it's happening. And if you command the EGR open, or if you open it with your hands, or if you open it with a vacuum pump, or draw it on it with your mouth or whatever, you ought to hear that engine idle rough whenever it's idling when you do that. If it doesn't idle rough, but the EGR is opening, then that means those passages are clogged up, and that's what you need to go look at right there. This is gas station parking lot repairs. I don't know what these guys were working on, but I was gassing up over there, and I noticed, look at this. These guys are they look like they're waiting on parts. They were just kind of sitting there, had their hood open on that thing, and who knows what they were doing. There was some stuff on I didn't walk over there to talk to them or anything, because quite frankly, they probably spoke Spanish, and I didn't understand what they were saying anywhere. I wouldn't. So I need to learn to speak Spanish, because there's a lot of Spanish-speaking folks around here. All right, let's see. This right here is a magazine. You've heard me talk about writing for Motor Age. Some of you may have read my Motor Age articles, but I wrote for this magazine from May of 2000 to February of 2022. I wrote several articles a year for them usually. One year I wrote an article every month, back a long time ago. But this magazine is over 100 years old. The reason they call it Motor Age was because we were going from horse and buggy to motors, pulling vehicles, and that's why they call it Motor Age, and it was written for people that worked on motors. And so the thing is still going. It's changed hands several times, and they were pretty good folks to write for and work with and all that, but there was always a changing of the guard up there, But the first time I had started writing emails back when we first got email over at the dealership, and I had an email address that I, mail people back and forth. And so Mitch Schneider was a guy that I used to read his articles in Motor Service magazine, and he was writing for Motor Age, and I wrote him a couple of emails, and then I started sending him pictures of stuff I was seeing in the shop at the dealership. And he asked me, he says, would you like to write a Motor Age article? So we need somebody to write one. I said, well, I could probably write one about a Power Stroke diesel. I hadn't seen a lot of those in there. And so Bill Cannon, who was the managing editor at the time, senior editor, he says, he called me, and he says, I'm going to give you 3 weeks to get this thing ready. Well, I'd already taken my pictures, and I knew what I was going to say. And so he says, this is how you email it to me. And so I went ahead and he said he was going to give me 3 weeks because it was the first one I'd ever written. I sat down and typed it, and I sent it to him in 2 hours. And he sent me a contract so I could write for him for a long, long time. But things move on after a while. Younger people come along, and they actually start shifting away from the kind of stories that I used to write and all that kind of thing. And that's fine. Now they sent me a little plaque, when I was at the 19-year thing. I actually wrote for them for 22 years. And for the last few years, I was like the senior contributing editor. They didn't bill me that way, but I had been with the magazine and writing for it longer than anybody else they had at the time. But I hadn't written anything for them for 2 or 3 years now. These teenagers, I thought this was funny. Whenever their granny was out of town somewhere, these 2 teenage boys were pretty doggone sharp. They went and bought all these hot rod parts. Look at that manifold, that 4-barrel carburetor. They put on that straight 6, and they souped it up. And Granny noticed it ran a lot different whenever she came back. She didn't really know what was going on, but they spent, I don't know where they got their money, but it said they spent about $750 souping up Granny's car without her knowledge, and it was funny. And there they are, burning the wheels, taking off. That thing must have been pretty stout. I just thought that was a funny story. That was me working at the Ford place in the good old 1990s. I had a lot of fun at that place. Worked there for 15 years. Went to work there in January 1985, and I worked there in until, you know, 2000, when I went to work into college or something like that. Okay, this was a workable solution. These guys that came from Nashville Auto Diesel College, which I didn't have. I'm not hating on Nashville Auto Diesel College. It's changed. It's different. Got a different name now. But they always knew principles really well. They were pretty good mechanics. But if they ran into a problem that they weren't taught about in the, you know, up there, one of the things I taught my students whenever I was teaching at the college over there was I wanted to make doggone sure that they knew how to solve problems. And problem solving is what we do. This guy right here was he understood all the principles and procedures and everything, but he had this pilot bearing that all the needles were going out of, and he was trying to figure out how to get that shell out of there. And he came over, and I had never done it this way before, but I just went over there to my toolbox and I said, well, I think I can do it this way. And I got a carriage bolt, ground both sides of it off, and it would actually go in there and hook on this lip and on that lip. And then I got a socket and a washer. You know, a socket, it was bigger than this, and a washer and a nut and with a little grease on the threads, and I just extracted that thing right out of there. That was a little way that I came up. That's a workable solution. Another thing he asked me to help him with was you know, some of them, you guys ever had these cast iron manifolds on some of these small block Chevys? You pull the manifold off, do your work. When you go to put the manifold back on, the holes don't line up anymore because everything's warped and changed a little bit. And he was saying, I can't get these holes don't line up anymore, you know, because they had come in. And so I got a socket and a bolt and a nut and made a little thing to jack them apart. You can buy a thing that will do this from the tool truck. But anyway, I use that to sort of, you know, with threads you can do just about anything, you know, if you got room to work and threads are big enough and strong enough. So I've jacked that thing apart a little bit. It's either going to break or the holes are going to line up again, and if it breaks, you know, if you can't get the bolts in it, you might as well go ahead and do whatever you have to. Anyway, I showed him how to do that. But, you know, being able to think on the fly and come up with a quick fix is always really beneficial whenever you're in there. Every mechanic, and I taught my guys how to weld, and I taught them how to use a torch and how to use a torch safely. If you don't know how to use a torch safely, you can kill yourself using a dadgum torch. A acetylene torch I'm talking about, not a propane torch. But everybody needs to know how to weld. Both, you know, do coat hanger welding with a torch and also with stick welding. You know, the MIG stuff, you know, if you know how to use a MIG welding machine, you can just, bzzz, you know, pull the trigger and you got a gaseous shield coming out, and I mean, you don't even have to worry about moving in two directions with that like you do when you're stick welding. But anyway, that's some stuff everybody needs to know how to do. My dad taught me how to sharpen a drill bit. Most mechanics I know won't even attempt to sharpen a drill bit unless they got a jig for doing it. And I got to where I could sharpen a drill bit really good. These Escorts are almost completely gone. You know, I hardly ever see any of these anymore. They were decent little cars, and a lot of people really liked them. The odd thing about the one-year model of them, or a few years, was that they seemed to run really warm. I mean, the engine would run almost up into the hot, and that was just the way it was. They were normally supposed to run that hot, but people were confused by that. And I got in one day. It's the only one I ever saw that had a turbocharger on it. And I said, this was like in the 80s. I said, I have never seen an Escort with a turbocharger. It was not aftermarket. This was a factory turbocharger. And the little indicator light on the dash would turn green when you had turbo boost. And I thought, that little pancake turbocharger is the dumbest looking thing I've ever seen. Well, I did whatever kind of work I did. It was car was under warranty. And I was going to go on a test drive on it. And boy, I tell you what, when that turbocharger kicked in, that thing got some torque steer, just about jerked me off the road, broke the tires loose, scared the daylights out of me. And I don't know how many Ford's Escorts they made with that turbocharger on it, but that was an extremely interesting ride, and it had some serious power out there in traffic. This was that fan board that I built. I'd give these guys this schematic, which is not complicated, and I would have the board set up so that it would be pretty much the same. In other words, the switches were down here on my schematic and up here on the board. You turn this switch on, the fans would run at half speed, you mash that button, the fans would kick on and run full speed. Well, funny thing about it was, even if one student watched another one wire this up, you cannot take a picture of this or look at it and figure out how it's wired up. You're going to have to look at that schematic and wire it up yourself. This other board back here was easier to wire up. It was fuel injection board, and I had all of the pins marked, and the pins were numbered on here and all that kind of thing. And both these boards were really instructive. I didn't pay much of anything. This one here I built out of junk parts from a 98 Explorer. This one here, I bought these fans, bought those relays and those relay sockets, and these switches and all from the parts store, and I printed all this to put it on this board. The maintenance man built me this stand here, and I put all the stuff on the board. I spent about that's a fuse right there, by the way, but I spent about $145 or something like that building this board. Now, if you want to buy one from one of these training companies, you can pay them $5,000 or $6,000. They're not going to have anything like this. I also had another one I've talked about on here, where I taught my students about ignition systems, and I had all of the ignition systems, all the way from Points ignition, all the way up through the Ford, the Chrysler, the GM, and all the way up to the coil pack ignition. And I didn't put cop coil on there, but I even had a distributor wired up to plugs, and whenever you turn the distributor, and everything on that board would make sparks. And they learned an awful lot by ignition. And I used to lay this stuff out on the table and show them how I could make sparks like that. And I even told them how there was one time I was working on this go-kart, an old Briggs & Stratton engine in it, and I went over there to the turf and timber place to get a set of points or something for it. And I said, I need a set of points for this lawnmower. That was before electronic ignition, was on lawnmowers. And the guy said, how do you know the coil's good? And I said, well, I used it to start my wife's car. They were totally flabbergasted by that. But I did. I hooked it up to my wife's Tempo, and that thing, whenever it was being fired by that TFI ignition module, it would make a spark an inch long, This right here, this guy had his philosophy was, if you see a bolt, take it out. I don't even remember why he took this apart. It was wacky. He had all of this stuff in a plastic bucket when he brought it over here, and this thing, just a disaster. So he has it drawn, they pulled in on the hook, and they hand me the ticket to put all this nonsense back together. So he had to take all them little bitty parts. I never went this far taking one of these apart whenever I was working on that. You didn't have to. But some people, when they go to fix something, they strip it all the way down, and they feel like if there's two parts that are connected to each other, they need to take them apart before they can finish the job. Now, for the people that just start working on cars, use common sense and think before you wrench. Know how the system or the component works. There is a description and operation section in the shop manual that's really important. Check the easy stuff before you go after the hard and expensive stuff. In other words, if you've got an overheating problem and you're not sure what it is, it makes more sense to replace the thermostat first and see what that does. Make sure you burp the air out of it before you pull the cylinder head off, assuming there's a cylinder head gasket. Mike, the guy I worked with back in the 70s, said that there was an aircraft mechanic that somebody just horsed around and swapped a couple of plug wires around on his pickup truck, and he was confused about that enough to where he pulled the cylinder head off. And of course, an aircraft mechanic can be really good at working on an aircraft, but not be worth a flip at working on a car. I wouldn't be worth anything working on an aircraft. So basically, because somebody's an aircraft mechanic doesn't mean they can fix anything and everything. Now, there are some guys that are aircraft mechanics that are also good automobile mechanics, and I worked with a guy like that. But one day, he and I mentioned this before, but it was a long time ago. We were working on one of those old Mercury Capris that was like you think about those. You can look those up. A neat little car back in 1971, and it had a European look to it. And we had a little V6 in it, and we pulled the transmission out of it. Lost one of the bolts. And he said, well, I don't know what happened to that other transmission bolt. And so he says, well, go to your dad's Volkswagen shop and see if he's got a metric bolt like this. So he carries that bolt down there, and he asked my dad, he says, Lloyd, do you have a metric bolt like this? And my dad looked at that bolt and said, that's not metric, that's US standard 3/8. And I thought, why could Dad look at this and tell what it was, and this other guy who was a really good vehicle mechanic and also an aircraft mechanic not just glance at a bolt and tell what size it was in the thread pitch? It just totally amazed me. And I said, if Dad can do that, I can do that. And then I taught a lot of my students to do that. I'd have an exercise where they had to figure all that out and look at the bolt, and within a very, almost exactly every time you need to be able to look at a wrench size and tell what it is. You need to be able to look at bolt size and thread pitch. And because if you're calling the parts store and you need a bolt and it's not a specific bolt that they can look up, if you call, you can't, if you can't go into the parts room and throw a bolt on the counter and say, give me one like that, like the old guys used to do at the Ford place over there. You need to be able to say, I need a 10 millimeter, 1.5 thread pitch bolt, and it needs to be, and you can give them the length in inches or millimeters. When you tell them that, they know what to send you. But if you don't have some common way of talking to them on the phone about that, then you're going to be in trouble. So you need to be able to tell them what it is you need if you're ordering parts over the phone. A lot of the times they'll match it up and all that kind of stuff. But I like to be able to go in there, and I'd go in the parts room at the Ford place and I'd tell them what size bolts I needed. And they would come and put it on the counter, and then I'd go. But here's one right here. Some people will do all of this at the same time to save time. If you're an experienced guy, that's okay. But somebody that's just learning does not need to drain the oil and then start on the tire rotation while we got the oil draining, because chances are they're going to forget something and they're liable to start it up without oil in it. And so my deal was, when I was teaching these guys, do the oil change from start to finish, get done with that, make sure it's all right, and then do the tire rotation. Because if you start doing both those jobs at the same time, and you're not somebody that's been doing this a long time with a lot of practice, you're going to get in some serious trouble. And this one guy that went to work at a dealership, he had this methodical way that he did stuff in a certain order, doing an oil change. There was nothing wrong with the way he was doing it. And they told him to do something different at the dealership, about something to do with, no, you do this and you take then. Somebody told him they wanted him to do it their way, and he managed to forget to put the oil filter back on because they changed his routine. Which is just, whenever you're doing things the same way every time, you're less likely to make a mistake. But if you're just all over the map doing it this way and that, and somebody's trying to change things up, you get in trouble. These two guys travel around, and they usually have lunch at the same place when they eat together. I've seen these two cars parked next to each other all over town around lunchtime. These are old geezers that have fixed these cars up really, really, really nice. Look at those shiny paint jobs. Isn't that pretty? So you got a Chevy guy and a Ford guy both driving old 60s vintage cars. This lady right here worked at the college, and from the time this car was new until right before I retired, or right after I retired, right before I retired, we worked on this car and we did all the maintenance on it after it was out of warranty. And she sent me this text, and whenever it hit 300,000 miles, and said, the Honda and I made it thanks to you. And it was a 07 model car or something like that, but she really put a lot of miles on it. I taught this bunch of guys at El Paso, Texas. They were the Border Patrol mechanics at the Border Patrol station out there in El Paso. It's the only time I ever stood behind a Department of Homeland Security podium in my whole life. But this was an interesting gig when I went out there to teach those electronic diesel classes to these guys. But now, one of the things that's really odd, when I was at the Ford place, I never ran into this. But one time we worked on an Escort out there that had a misfire code. And I pulled the misfire code. We found out why it was misfiring. It had a bad injector connection and all that. And we fixed that. And I had cleared the code out of this room, the OBD2 enhanced room. But what a lot of us don't realize is this is a different room. And even though I cleared it out of this room, the check engine light was still on. But when I went into the generic room, a lot of the times we bypass this room and go into this room because we feel like this one here is the big boy's room. So this one here still had the code stored when I had cleared it out of this room. So it wasn't showing up in here, but the check engine light was still on. When I went in here, I found that misfire code still there. The weird thing about it was, all those years I worked at the Ford place, I never saw this a single time. After I went to the college, I saw it one time. So just remember that the wires, I mean the network you're getting these codes out of is not the same one that gives you these codes. You see that K line? That one right there is the 9141. Anyway, and there's the L line. But this right here is typically, if I remember right, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, because I forget things sometimes. But your other stuff comes out of these other pins. Now this is not the same on every vehicle. The only thing is ubiquitous on every vehicle. And usually these right here will give you your generic codes. This one's always hot. 4 and 5 are always ground. So always remember that 4 and 5 are ground, 16 is hot, if you remember the shape of that connector. And usually these two right here will be your generic codes. But your enhanced codes are going to come out on a different wire. And just a lot of the times that's just in your face. A lot of people only already know that, but you know. Now this guy right here, his name is Richard Sheffield. He came and taught a class to Carport Auto Parts at a right after I went to teach at the college. Only car I had that would run was an 87 Honda Accord that was there when I went there. No other car would run. That's all I had when I first went there. And I said, he says, you got started to run? I said, yeah, I got this Honda out here. So I pulled it in there and it was sitting there running. He connected his Snap-on counselor to it. He looked at this waveform and he said, I see a problem here. Well, I was thinking, really? I mean, how are you supposed to look at a vacuum waveform like that and see a problem? Well, you might be able to look at it if you're familiar with vacuum waveforms. At the time, I wasn't. And he said, I think that this thing is out of time, one tooth. And I went, really? He says, yeah, let's check the compression. And so we got a compression gauge, and the engine was good and warm. And the thing had high compression. I mean, the compression was like 270 pounds or something like that. He said, yeah, it's a tooth out. He said it seemed like, if I remember right, the timing was advanced one tooth. And we didn't look at it that night, but that's what he said was going on. And I said, well, that's just really interesting. I kind of filed that away. And I had my students the next morning take that thing apart and check the timing marks. And sure enough, he was right on target. That thing was one tooth advanced. And what happens is, if the timing is advanced like that on one of those cars, and the rings are kind of worn anyway, if the intake valve closes before the piston is at the bottom of his intake stroke, then it's going to create some low pressure and pull oil up, and it's doing a cylinder wet test all the time. And so this guy knew what he was doing. And he brought that machine with him. That wasn't one that I had at school. But anyway, that was one of the most interesting things I saw, is how apparently he had seen this before or something, but looking at that waveform and determining that that thing was one tooth off boggled my mind, and it still does. I don't know if I can do that even now. Alright, now if you got this resistor here and it's brown, red, and that's gold over there. You can't tell it, but it is. So brown, red, and gold. Why is the resistor there? So why is that resistor in there? This is a power window switch. This LED is what lights the underside of the button so you can see whether you're going up and down. If you've got an LED that's got voltage connected to it, it needs to be going through a resistor before it gets to the LED. So that's what this resistor is here for. So if you took brown, okay, this one here would be brown, right? So that's 10, right? Alright, there's red, 2, that's 2, that's your second digit. And there's another red. Alright, that's how many zeros you got. Okay, so what do you got there? You got brown, and you got red. Figure out the number of ohms. You got that? And the way I've told my students to do this is I would say, we're going to remember this with this, what I put together. I don't like the one they originally started. When you got girls in the class, you don't need to be saying what they used to say back in the 40s when they came up with this code, so I came up with my own. Big Billy ran over young George because Vicky grew weed. Black, brown, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, gray, white. and so that works really well to decode those resistors. Now the newest resistors are the teeny tiny square things with numbers on them, so you don't have to decode those. A mechanic will notice this when somebody else might not. That was why this engine was cutting out, going down the road. Cut off, cut up, cut out, cut off. That's a crank sensor. You might notice on the Ford they always had, even way back in the old EEC3 days, the crank sensor always had a gray wire and a blue wire going to it. And this crank sensor right here was on a Ranger or something. Anyway, I don't remember what it was on, but I do remember it was scraping against that bracket right there, and there was copper showing whenever I pulled that back to look at it, and that needed to be fixed. This guy gave up on the latch and just figured he'd just let it be a hole in the tailgate. This guy right here engineered a fix. He put a couple of screws in there, drilled him some holes, put some screws in there. He said, this thing is not coming off again. And you always got, this is the guy that's really thinking. This guy right here just figured, what the heck, I can pull these rods and open the tailgate if I need to, Now this right here was a prior knowledge situation. I was working at this, I worked for a while at an international truck dealer. And I don't remember if I've talked about this before or not, but it was the military had this bucket truck they bought. It was yellow, but they brought the bucket truck in there because the hydraulics wouldn't work on it. And they brought it to the international dealer because it was an international truck. And this was back in the mid-'80s, before I went to work at the Ford place. And so I had worked on forklifts when I was down in southeast Texas, and I had actually taken a lot of these pumps apart and put them back together, these V10 and V20 pumps. And this little casting mark tells you the pump flow. If you put this you can put this thing in here backwards. See, this thing's, and if you put this in here so that that is on that side pointing this way, that pump is going to be, it won't pump because it's going to be trying to pull in from the suction, push out on the suction side, pull in from the pressure side. And see how that one is? See, that's right there. That indicator, if this is in there the wrong way, then you're going to have some issues. When the pressure would come in here and it goes out there is what it amounts to, and so it pumps it through there. And so I told the guy that I was working for, I went out there, rolled up under a creeper, looked at that, looked at these, how they were hooked up, and I said, that pump's put together wrong. Now see, that was prior knowledge. Anybody else that looked at that pump that did not know this specific thing would never have been able to figure out by just glancing at that pump what was wrong with that bucket. Right now they may have replaced the pump, but all I needed to do was take those bolts out, pull this vane housing out, flip it around, put it back in there the right way, and then we had hydraulics. That was just really simple. But some of the stuff that, everybody's got their own repository of knowledge in their head, under their hat, so to speak, that they can use, that makes them look like a wizard to people that don't have that knowledge. So the more knowledge you can gather, the smarter you're going to be. And that's one of the things that I try to teach my students. Remember things. I had one guy that I worked with that could remember all kinds of stuff. He wasn't good at troubleshooting, but he used prior memory stuff to figure everything out. If you got prior memory and you can also figure things out, you got the best of both worlds. This one guy that I knew had a good memory about all the stuff he'd already seen, but if it was something he had never seen before, he was out of ideas almost immediately. And so I could tell stories about that guy. He was a good guy, and I helped train him, Well, that was the end of this one here. We've gone about 39 minutes, close to 40, and I appreciate you guys watching if you've made it this far. And I'll talk to you guys next week. And again, Happy New Year. Be careful out there.